everyone, and thank you for joining us here. I am sitting down with my dear and old friend, Gareth Higgins. That is to say, our friendship is old, not that he is necessarily old. Gareth is a longtime friend. We've been in North Carolina together in various parts of the state for the better part of 20 years. But he is from Northern Ireland, where he has worn many hats between there and the US, between being a peace activist, a film critic, a storyteller, a writer, overall raconteur, and great guy. Welcome, Gareth Higgins.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be with you. I'm actually thinking, in all the time we've known each other, have you ever interviewed me before?
No, I never.
Oh,
Enough. I never
wow.
have.
Wow.
And you've never interviewed me before either.
That can't be true. That can't be
I don't
true.
think so. You've had the film talk for ages. I've had a very intermittent interviewing platform for ages. So yeah, it just
Yeah.
so happens, I think, between the subject matters and whatever we
The
have.
singular, I think some of your audience will recognize that with us finally doing this, that the singularity has arrived.
Yes, amen. It's that collapsing point where even the exponents are growing exponentially. And just maybe it's the explosion of faith, hope, and love that we're all waiting for in these strange and troubled times.
I hope
So
so. We'll make whatever contribution we can.
yeah, I wanted to talk to you today about a couple of your most recent books, as well as a gathering that is coming up. And let's start with your most recent, which you have co authored with Kathleen Norris. It's called A Whole Life in 12 Movies, A Cinematic Journey to Deeper Spirituality. And in it, you're consistently pointing to movies as portals for personal and collective transformation. So when you're talking about Kubrick's classic 2001, A Space Odyssey, you suggest that it might be, quote, the most optimistic film ever made. What makes you hold out so much hope for cinema's capacity to change us even through challenging or ambiguous works?
Well, it's funny in a sense that that's two different questions because one is about 2001 Space Odyssey itself, and the other is about cinema
That's fair.
general.
Why don't we parse those out? So why is 2001, which has been parodied in everything, like the most recently the Barbie movie, with this sort of look at this idea of, I don't know, our growth as a species, outside
Mhm.
influence. Like, what is it about this film that so captures you?
It's an experience in the way that listening to a symphony is an experience that's different when you're actually in a concert hall compared with listening on speakers at home or in your car, wherever you listen to music, um, where it operates at a level that isn't simply analytical. It's not plot driven. There's really story of 2001 is really very simple. A lot of people find they experience it as impenetrable, but I think it's because they're looking for the wrong thing. That
Hmm.
2001's a lot more being at somewhere like the Teze community and listening to the chanting, or a silent retreat, or being in the outdoors, and I guess they call it forest bathing, or letting the ocean, the little waves of the ocean lap at your feet, and think about the fact that when you're standing on the shore and the water is touching your toes, that same water further out is this enormous chasm of ineffable size, and sometimes a sense of real threat and danger, certainly drama and spectacle. So watching 2001 for me has always been this experience of awe and wonder. My dad introduced me to it when I was quite young, so it's been there in the background of my life for a long time. But from a story perspective, and again, as I say, the story is really quite simple. All it is the evolution of the human race. That's all it is, right? It's
Just that.
nothing more and nothing less. But it speaks to archetypes that I think are deep within our psyches. And the primary identification figure in 2001 is a man who is willing to risk his own life to save the life of his friend. And this is a spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen it. He does not succeed in saving the life of his friend, But for some reason, he is then propelled through a tunnel filled with spectacular light and image, which I think is representative of what it's like to be born. Even if you were born by C-section, you had an experience of being like thrust and pulled through something, and if we were conscious of it at the time, it might have felt like dying to be born. It might have felt like the most frightening thing that had ever happened to us. But there's something on the other side, and that's what I mean about 2001 being optimistic. That it imagines both a micro level future for any of us that might be going through ordeals at the moment. And also, I guess you could call it a macro level or a metaphysical future for the human race, that there is an evolutionary process going on. And that evolutionary process is not antithetical to the idea of there being an utterly benign, loving creator, whether or loving intelligence, whether you call that God or something else. So, funny thing is, Stanley Kubrick, who directed 2001, I mean, it was a deep collaboration with Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote it with him. It's often misremembered. 2001, the movie, is not based on a novel called 2001.
Mhm.
They were both written as part of the same process.
Mhm.
And I can't remember, the novel may well have been published before the movie came out, but they were both being written at the same time.
Mhm.
And the film was a deeply collaborative project. But Stanley Kubrick always refused to answer questions about what he thought the meaning of the film was,
Mhm.
not to be inscrutable or difficult. I I think he actually said something like, "No matter what I think this is about, it's up to you
Mhm.
what it does to you." And that maybe connects with the sort of second way of that I could interpret this question about why do I take optimism, why do I take anything from movies? I think for it can be any art form, depending on which one speaks to you the most. I was raised by parents who loved the theater. My mother's a theater teacher and speech and drama teacher, and they introduced me to good, substantial movies when I was a kid, and they went into my psyche in a deep way. Movies like Gandhi, movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a couple of French films called Jean de Florette and Manon of the Spring, which are exquisite Shakespearean tragedies. And I think they did three things, at least three things to me. One was they showed me a different world than the one I recognized for myself. And so they opened my horizons.
Mhm.
The second is the kind of converse of that. They made me feel seen, even though a mental institution in Oregon and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was about as far away from my life in Belfast as you could get, or India in the first half of the 20th century in Gandhi was about as far away from my life as you could get. I still felt seen by these films
Mhm.
because Cuckoo's Nest opened me up to empathy, and I could feel compassion for others and also feel some of it for myself. And Gandhi opened me up to the idea that there are injustices in the world that can be overcome through creative nonviolence. And that I don't know what the chicken and the egg is. Like maybe that awakened something in me that was already there, or maybe it gave birth to it for the first time. And then I think the third thing it did to me, and this is where I think cinema differs from other art forms, the the experience of watching images projected on a screen
Mhm.
that's bigger than you. And while I watch a lot of movies on televisions, it is never the same as the experience of seeing them in a theater that's bigger than you. And then there's
Mhm.
variations on how well projected the film is in the theater and the design of the screen and how far you are from the screen, things like that. The experience of seeing things projected on a screen from behind, almost like at the subconscious level, it was almost like it went through my skull, through my brain, onto the screen, and then bounced back at me. And when you're watching a movie, you're entering into somebody's dream. Now, when you're listening to a symphony or any other form of music or reading a book, you are entering into somebody else's dream as well. So I'm not saying the cinema is a better art form.
Mhm.
I'm just saying it's actually closer to the experience of dreaming than any other art form because you're watching images.
Mhm.
And at times, it's much rarer for me now, but at times I would feel like I had almost blended with the movie itself, that there was no boundary between me and what was happening on the screen. So that's why I love cinema.
Yeah, that's really profound. And what you said a few minutes ago about how it can be any medium, it's interesting. My first exposure to 2001 was neither the film nor the novel, but the
Mm.
comic book adaptation that
Oh, really?
Jack Kirby wrote and drew.
Huh.
Initially, it was like a treasury sized, more faithful adaptation of the film, like this massive volume.
Huh.
And then
Huh.
he started doing an ongoing series, riffing on it more freeform in the late 70s.
Really?
Yeah,
Have you got those?
I do. Yeah. I'll...
Can we stop this interview right now and I come over to your house and steal them?
yeah, I will lend them to you because
Oh,
they're
wow.
really interesting. For those who don't know, and maybe you don't know this, Jack Kirby is a legendary comic book creator, created the Fantastic Four, the X-Men,
Yeah.
helped Steve
Yeah.
Ditko with the design of Spider-Man, actually did Captain America back in the 40s. And at this
Mm.
point, in the 70s, he's been I don't know, whether it's the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end of his artistic career, but he ends up using 2001 as a launch pad for his own still very fertile imagination.
Mm.
And by the end, like I think around issue number 10 of the more freeform riffing of 2001, he introduces a new character called X-51, or the Machine Man, and starts to ask questions about robotic life, artificial intelligence, excuse me, like what is sentience and what is that spark of life. And obviously, the original film has Hal, but he takes it in this really interesting direction around programming and agency that I did not read them when they first came out, but I got into Machine Man probably by the late 80s and started collecting the back issues of the Kirby adaptation. And I think you're right. Each medium does different things. In
Mm.
understanding comics back in 93, Scott McCloud hypothesized that the sequential art form of comics, which he traces back
Mm.
to like Egyptian hieroglyphs, he believes it combines image and language in a very particular way that engages the left and the right brain simultaneously in a rather unique way. And
Mm.
so it is interesting to think about, as Marshall McLuhan would say, how the medium is the message. So I
Mm.
love what you're saying
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
the backward projected nature of film, which I even think that I've heard you say before also, that's different than, of course, watching it on a television screen, that like the direction of the projection subtly changes what it is that is being perceived. And so it's so interesting to think about these different ways that the medium is the message.
What I've read, and I don't know if this is, um, credible or has been, uh, you know, proven, but it does have the ring of truth for me, is that digital projection, which has been the dominant form for nearly the last 20 years, actually affects the brain differently than the projection of celluloid 35 millimeter, which we all grew up with. And the reason for that is the 35 millimeter projection is 24 frames a second. There is actually imperceptible to the conscious mind. There are 24 images being projected at very high speed every second. Now, we just see them as a fluid motion, but
Yeah.
in a digital projection, there's no flicker of the 24 frames. It's a flat image, as it were. And so one of the reasons I like it, that there's a bit of a resurgence of celluloid projection, a bit like there's a bit of a resurgence of vinyl. It's not just a nerdy thing. It's actually, for me, it's a better experience. It feels like I'm seeing an actual object, as
Mm,
opposed to when I'm watching digital projection, I feel like I'm looking through it.
yeah.
That it's almost not even there. Now, there are techniques with digital imagery or films that have been shot digitally, and that's a paradox even to call them films, because they're not shot on film anymore. But movies that are shot digitally, there are little tweaks and filters and things that can make the image look more like
Wow.
film, and I appreciate that. And but it's not still not the same thing of that the flicker, apparently, that flicker that's imperceptible to the conscious mind goes in some kind of deeper way, or it may have something to do with left brain, right brain stuff. At any rate, the what I advocate and encourage is anytime that you can see a film in the best possible projection with the largest possible screen where the seats are oriented toward the screen in the best way. And it's one of the, I don't want to call it a tragedy, but it is a one of the negative aspects of multiplexes is that when multiplexes are built, they want to maximize their footprint. So they'll put 14 screens into a building that might be better with 9 screens. And 7 of those 14 screens are little shoe boxes where they are longer than they are wide. And so when you're watching the film, if you're looking at me, you're like looking inward like that. And that's not the same thing as looking slightly up and out. And I think ultimately it doesn't. There's a lot of filmmakers who they're just happy to get their movies screened in a theater, but a lot of the time, the kind of attention that some of the singer-songwriters that we know, people like Dave Wilcox, who is deeply concerned for the quality of sound at his concerts, not in a pedantic way, not in a kind of a intellectually superior way, but because he wants the audience to be able to hear the music at its best possible quality. A
Sure.
lot of multiplexes, a lot of multiplexes are not run by people
Mm.
who even know about these things, or if they are run by people who know about these things, the corporation that owns the theater doesn't care about these things and therefore doesn't resource them to do things. But with a few little tweaks, like
Mm.
making sure that the projection bulb is at its maximum, or it's maybe not maximum, at its ideal brightness,
Mm.
keeping the lights off until at least halfway through the credits at the end so that people have a moment to breathe when the
Yeah.
film is over. Things like that would make a difference and would probably lead to more people going to the theater, because I think a lot of people who are
Mm.
real cinema aficionados these days are watching movies at home simply because they can control the environment better and it's a more pleasant viewing experience than a lot of theaters have.
And for those who don't think of themselves as cinema aficionados, they might not consciously register why they don't enjoy going to the movies as much as they did when they were a kid. But what you're saying is it might not just be nostalgia. It's this sort of fixation on efficiency that has ended up possibly even impacting the almighty bottom line. That is what these mega corporations actually care about.
Yeah. And mega corporations are sometimes run by people with interesting ideas that just don't don't that perhaps the boards and the shareholders don't know would be that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the bottom line is not the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or the thing that even those shareholders and board members would most enjoy.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the love of cinema and some of the other films that you commentate on in your book with Kathleen. So, in your commentary on Wonder Woman 1984, you take what could be seen as just another superhero movie and one that if memory serves wasn't the most well received, but you unpack it.
No, not at all.
Yeah. And you unpack it though as this like profound meditation on desire, sacrifice, and collective healing. So
Hmm.
how did you develop the ability to find spiritual and social wisdom in popular films that others have clearly dismissed?
Look, I don't know that it's hard to answer that question without sounding like I'm saying I'm superior to others, but at the same time, everybody knows more about something than other people do. And I think the problem is our society structures itself in such a way that it values certain kinds of knowledge over others, and every now and again that knowledge is worthy of being admired more highly, like the knowledge of curing diseases. That's knowledge that's worth paying attention to. But I also think the knowledge of how to treat sewage and to clean up trash is should be much more valued than it is in our
As we
society.
have learned here in Western North Carolina.
Oh
And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Some very conscientious people have been doing some very difficult manual work
yeah.
over the last few months since the hurricane. And I think that the gift or the talent or the skill and of interpreting stories and images and helping audiences deepen their experience of those stories and images is wonderful. Ted Gioia, I think is how you pronounce his name, a wonderful writer, has a book called How to Listen to Jazz. And I've loved jazz for 35 years, but I don't know about jazz. And I'm excited to read that book. And I learned a lot about how to read a film, literally from a book by someone called James Monaco called How to Read a Film. And my friend Mark Cousins, who's a wonderful, passionate, truly romantic lover of cinema, who helped me to see that there's more to movies than Hollywood. And that doesn't mean Hollywood doesn't matter. And David Thompson, who a lot of people feel is the best traditional film critic writing in English today. These people opened me up to seeing something more than movies are just for fun or for escapism. But I also think being around the peace movement in the north of Ireland tuned me into paying attention to how movies treat violence, which is one of the things that most frequently occurs in popular movies. It's a very, we just take it for granted. But if
Yeah.
we step back from it and go, like, why are the most popular movies often the ones that have the most shooting and car chases and explosions? And part of that's just that the
Hmm.
mind likes spectacle.
Yeah.
I think it's also a lack of imagination on the part of the systems that make these these movies.
Hmm.
Now, Wonder Woman 1984 did not do well at all for two reasons. One is it was released at the end of the first year of COVID, and it was released both in theaters and on TV at the same time.
Hmm.
Um, so a lot of people weren't going to theaters at the time. And the second thing is it does something very unusual in that it asks something very unusual for a blockbuster. It asks something of the audience. It asks the audience to open their minds and pay attention. And one of the ways it does that is it's two different genres. It's a satire of 1980s action movies like Rambo, Die Hard, and so on,
Hmm.
and people going into a superhero movie are not or a comic book hero movie are generally not expecting a satire. They might with a movie like The Avengers, which is the most popular comic book movies of recent years. Yes, there's a few jokes here and there, but it's
Hmm.
mostly for the action and I think the sense of community among the Avengers. So the first problem is a lot of people didn't like Wonder Woman, I think, because they didn't realize it's a comedy,
Hmm.
and so they were laughing at it, thinking they were laughing at it, when actually the people behind that film, especially the director Patty Jenkins, knew exactly what they were doing. That when I'm laughing with it, and the second thing, it is an absolutely serious film about desire, selfishness, grief, and accepting uncertainty. And it does something at the climax. This will also be a spoiler, but in order to talk about the film meaningfully, I need to say it. It does something at the climax that almost no large scale film has ever done before. And that is, instead of killing the villain or hauling him off somewhere, the villain actually gets to repent, to recant his selfishness, to recognize what's driving his selfishness is his own trauma and wounds, and to see that the impact of his selfish actions is that it is destroying the world. Not only that, the entire human race gets to see that when we or when I pursue selfish desire, I might have some immediate gratification, but it's bad not only for everyone around me, it's ultimately bad for me. And that Diana, Wonder Woman, is unable to physically overcome this bad guy. It is the authority of her voice that causes the change to happen in this film. And I'll say, like, I've rarely been as moved by a film or felt like a film had more to say to our contemporary culture, because there are a lot of what I heard Mark Maron the other day refer to as broken boys in alpha husks who are projecting their
Hmm.
Bruce Coburn had this line, projecting their shit at the world, self hatred tarted up as payback time. And I think there's a lot of people, there's a kind of broken masculinity that's manifesting as dominating others because it can't see that a world in which everybody has a fair share is a good world for everyone. It
Hmm.
might mean that some of us who had an unfair large share in the past end up having less of that, but that's not a net loss. And even if you are a broken boy in an alpha husk, even if you are the quintessential cisgender middle class white straight man, your wounds deserve attention too. Your pain is worthy of compassion as well. And I don't think our culture's done very well at saying that a wound is a wound, and if that we that everybody's pain deserves compassion,
Hmm.
and to whom much has been given, much will be required. And if you have more power to start with and you misuse it, then you're more responsible for fixing the problem that you've created. Now, I know that my opinion on Wonder Woman is a minority opinion,
Hmm.
and I think, but this is when it comes down to like you can't be, you can be mistaken if you think you see something in a film that simply is objectively not there. If you
Sure.
say that's it, that scene where so and so shot so and so, when you go back and you watch it and you see they didn't actually shoot them, unless George Lucas has re-edited the film. But you can't be mistaken about art if your response to it is honest.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm not interested in telling people, even though I joke about it sometimes, that my opinion on Wonder Woman is correct. It's more like I want to encourage people, go back and watch that and ask yourself, like, the meaning of this film in our world today.
Yeah.
Like, this is important, and this is important to pay attention to. And you may not feel like the film accomplishes its intentions. That's not the most important thing. The more important thing is, like, what are we going to do about broken boys and alpha husks? And what are we going to do about our own selfishness? And what are we going to do about the pain experienced even by people who we don't like?
Yeah. Absolutely. And we could have a whole episode just about Wonder Woman. It's funny now I'm realizing, just like with 2001, I'm thinking about the source material that the film was drawn from in the comic book, and how Wonder Woman was created by this really interesting guy, William
Yeah,
Marston, who,
yeah.
among other things, also invented the polygraph. Uh, the
uh,
polygraph wasn't the only
that's a
way he was
lie. That's a
poly.
lie. That's a lie.
We were both going for jokes at the same time. And I said the polygraph was not the only way he was poly, because he also had two partners, his wife Elizabeth and his long-term partner Olive, and he had two children with each of them. And
Yeah.
Paradise Island, that is part of the mythos of Wonder Woman, doesn't, I guess nowadays we're starting to catch up to how all these things can hang together. But on the one hand, it was this radical feminist egalitarian society
Hmm.
where men were genuinely better off. It wasn't like a man
Hmm.
kind of thing. And also, there were themes of bondage and BDSM throughout
Mm.
the early Wonder Woman run. And no comic book writer has really tackled all of those themes as boldly as Grant Morrison did in recent years, with a three-part graphic novel encompassing these. And Grant Morrison themselves is a genderqueer occultist who lives in a castle in Scotland, also has some very interesting lifestyle choices. But the themes that they explore in the contemporary adaptations are how, the loving discipline of men by women might be the best thing that
Mhm,
men could experience. And that
mhm,
there is this sort of arc away from the myth of redemptive violence into what can be genuine reform and
mhm,
repentance. And it's
mhm,
telling to me that most of our stories, most of our popular imagination doesn't really have a genuine redemption arc like that from true villains. And it might be that our imaginations are so impoverished because of our popular art that we only see the possibility of killing the bad guy. And then, depending on where you sit, depends on who is the bad guy. And then we end up in the kind of culture and society that we're facing right now.
It's also, our culture doesn't have a lot of imagination about a hero arc either. And I think our larger scale popular culture doesn't have much imagination at all. I shouldn't say it doesn't have. It doesn't know how to use it. It doesn't
Yeah.
know how to use it. And when I think about some of the decisions that are being taken by some decisions taken by elected representatives, to me, aside from their potential cruelty, they just lack all imagination. I remember a few years ago on Twitter, somebody, I think what it was, somebody tweeted at Elon Musk that it would take some small amount of money in Elon's terms. I think it might have been $6 billion, right?
Mhm.
Small for Elon, to end global poverty.
Yeah.
And I remember, if I'm remembering correctly, he responded to that tweet saying, basically, okay, show me the evidence. And the sense I got was he was saying, all right, if you can prove to me that $6 billion will end global poverty, I'll give you $6 billion.
Hmm.
And other than elements of human nature and egoism, when I look at some of these people who have massive power and massive resources,
Yeah.
part of me just wants to say, go and spend a couple of days at an imagination retreat and ask yourself what you could do with that power for the good. Wouldn't you feel better about yourself?
Hmm.
Wouldn't you feel better about yourself?
Yeah.
Because there is nothing, I believe Marshall Rosenberg is right about this, that the kind of person who coined the idea of nonviolent communication, that there is nothing that makes a human happier than the experience of bringing more happiness or wonder or delight into the life of another.
Mm.
There's nothing that makes us more happy than that. And the reason why lots of us don't do that and don't make a practice of that is not because we can't, it's because nobody's ever modeled it for us
Hmm.
and spelled out. It's a better way to live, to go about your day trying to spread more love. It's not just morally better, it's actually better for you. It's healthier for you. You'll feel better. You'll be happier.
Yeah. So many of us end up in ruts where we don't question what is genuinely satisfying for us. We never
Yeah.
cultivate that
Yeah.
curiosity. And it's not only the ultra wealthy, although their one track minds have a greater impact on the rest of us,
Mhm.
arguably, than others. But I think we all can fall into that rut. In a little while, I want to talk about what an imagination retreat might look like and if there's one of those on the horizon. But let's do one more film. So, the way you discuss integrate silence
Mm.
suggests that silence itself can be a kind of film genre. And as you mentioned, as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, how has cinema in general, and also specifically with The Great Silence, helped you understand the relationship between silence, violence, and peace?
Wow. I think that silence, you can, there's at least there's two binary ways you can look at silence. And I think one of them's false and one of them's true. And I think the false way is the way maybe most of us, at least in Western culture, think of silence. And that is that silence is something you conjure up within yourself, or that you have to go to a really quiet place or even a soundproof room to experience it. The other is a more mystical, contemplative way of thinking about silence. And I've learned this from teachers through the years, that we might better see silence as something that already is,
Mm,
that silence already exists. Even right now, silence exists in this conversation. It's just a matter of choosing to join it, which I think is a resonant with an amazing thing that the late Congressman and civil rights activist John Lewis said when he was once asked how could he love the sheriff's deputy who was attacking him, I believe, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge at the Selma Civil Rights March in 1965. I think he was asked, how could you find that love within yourself?
mm,
And he said, that's a category error. The love was here. It wasn't like it wasn't something I had to find inside me.
mm.
I just joined it. I just joined it. And I think we can join the silence, integrate silence, and films like that can help us join the silence because they're about silence and they are quiet movies. They're about people. That particular movie is about men who've taken a vow of silence. They only speak once a week, I believe, at lunchtime on a Sunday. The film induces a sense of calm. My understanding is that it ran in a theater in New York for a long time. It's a 3 hour long movie because word got out that there was somewhere in Manhattan where you could have 3 hours of quiet, and so people
Wow.
would pay to go to see this movie. And so while I think that silent retreats and specifically taking time out, whether it's auditory silence or the silence of the heart, of course, that's it's helpful to take specific time to engage that kind of thing. I also think that part of the point of that is to help us discover the silence that already exists, the silence that exists inside us and between us. And there's a story about the I can't remember. I think it might have been the Dalai Lama and Thomas Merton who met up with each other in 1968 on what proved to be the last trip that Thomas Merton took on Earth. And I think it might have been the two of them. And if I'm mistaken, I'm sure they'll both forgive me. And they met and they didn't say much to each other. They just spent a few hours sitting quietly. And I think they understood that, as some people say, God's first language is silence, but also the most intimate form of communication between two people doesn't require a lot of words.
Yeah. What you're sharing reminds me of, I guess it was about a decade ago, there was a book that came out called Silence, A Christian History by, and this is a very Irish name. Is it Diarmuid MacCulloch? Is that how I would pronounce it?
Diarmuid MacCulloch, yeah.
Diarmuid MacCulloch, yeah. Yeah, and looking at that role of silence throughout church history, which includes the ways in which silence has been complicity as well, ways in which people have chosen to remain silent about various injustices, to look the other way, but then also that cultivating of intentional silence. And so it occurs to me that, yeah, there are these different ways that we can absorb silence, and one is a way of neglect and denial, and the other is a way of active embrace.
Say that last thing again.
What I find, even right now in our cultural and political moment, when there's just so much bombarding me, that I can be tempted to enter into a silence by default, which is to say either that I'm just overwhelmed and I just don't want to deal with it. So I just push things away. Whereas I could actually have the same outward action, which is to say, I want to limit my information diet because I'm recognizing that it's not helpful to have my cortisol continually spiked by the latest political outrage. But to do so from a standpoint of, one, yes, wanting to preserve my own peace, but also wanting to figure out what might be like the one action I can do this week that could actually make a difference.
Yeah.
It's difference, I think, between a silence of just default omission versus a silence of commission, where I'm saying, yes, I want to actually cultivate, or as you're saying, enter into that silence that already is, which may or may not be literal silence. Unless we live in a monastery or an ashram or a really quiet place in the world, we might not have the luxury of exterior silence. But my favorite...
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Your favorite.
The last thing I'll say is that, my favorite form of meditation centering prayer is, it's not based on external silence, nor is it based on concentration or non-interruption. It's based on whenever an interruption enters my field, whether that is an internal thought or discomfort or an external thought, I use a sacred word that returns to my center of gravity, that's like this muscle of release, that's letting go whatever that interference is, which enables me to cultivate a kind of internal silence or clarity.
I think that there's one thing I want to say in response to that is, I say these things advisedly and with care, because it can sometimes sound like it's easy for you to say because of the ease and privilege that my life has. And there's two things I'd say to that. Is one is, there are parts of my life that are not easy. and I do believe with John O'Donoghue that the duty of privilege is absolute integrity. And so part of our responsibility in life is to be asking ourselves and others to help us see, where do we have privilege and resources that we can use to serve others? And that's what we're supposed to do with those privileges and resources. And also to ask, where are the places where we have needs, and who are the safer and more creative people to ask for help? That's one thing. But the more important thing is, many of the people who've talked most profoundly about contemplative silence are people who've suffered some of the greatest torments that humans have meted out on each other. And I want to handle it with care. and not just quote it and throw it away. But I want to take seriously that people who've suffered exponentially more than I have, people like, I mean, I almost don't even want to say their names because it can sound like a throwaway thing. But
Mm.
maybe we all know some people like this, have often been those who've advocated the idea of finding the silence within. What you don't want to do, and and maybe a phase that some of us need to move through, is to make the silence or the contemplation all about me.
Hmm.
You know, and I don't like the term self help, because it can be so close to selfish or self oriented
Hmm.
help. The question for me is, how do we all love and be loved? Nobody needs to set out on a path of martyrdom.
Hmm.
Um, it is possible to shape a world in which everybody's needs are met and everybody's gifts are valued. It really is possible, for that world to come into being.
Hmm.
It's not weakness or shallowness to say so. It's not pie in the sky or Pollyanna. In fact, if you go back and read the story of Pollyanna, Pollyanna gets a bad name because she's not pretending that things are good when they're not. She's encouraging people to see the things that already are good. And then, lo and behold, you know what happens when people focus on the good? More, I was going to use some strong language here, but I don't know if that's allowed on your YouTube channel.
Oh,
So,
I think
more
go for it.
good things come into being
Hmm.
that help us with the hard things. And sometimes the most good thing is a loud and even audacious or forceful no to protect the vulnerable. But a lot of the time, it's just about championing what's already there that we usually don't mention or see.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you said about how, yeah, cultivating that silence is not merely for me, although it certainly benefits me, but it's what Thich Nhat Hanh called interbeing.
Yeah.
I think that it's easy to take pot shots at monasteries and ashrams, even like I did a few minutes ago. But the best ashrams and monasteries understand that their vocation of silence or meditation or a more intentional way of living is
Hmm.
for the sake of the whole. And the best ones even live that out practically in terms of the role of conscience and hospitality that they provide
Hmm.
for the larger culture. And yeah, I think that as we do these things that are vital for self care, it could even just be as simple as recognizing our inner being, recognizing our interconnectedness with others. And that if I take this moment to pause and to recollect myself, that it's like putting on my own oxygen mask first if the airplane
Yep.
is down. Like it will enable me to be
Yeah.
of more service to others, and therefore I should be
Hmm.
prepared to be of more service to others.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, I think it's worth shifting gears to another book that you have written. It was your second most recent one, if memory serves. You're prolific, so I could be wrong. But How Not to Be Afraid: 7 Ways to Live When Everything Seems Terrifying. I believe this came out in 2021, something like that, peak COVID lockdown season. And the book remains, perhaps sadly, very relevant in our current cultural and political moment. In these pages, you also share about your time growing up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, where fear was not unreasonable given everything
No.
that you were experiencing. And a lot of folks right now in the United States, particularly immigrants and people of color, queer folk, women, special needs folks, you name it, are feeling very similarly right now.
Hmm.
And as someone who's written extensively about transforming fear, how do you see the relationship between legitimate fears, the ones that keep us safe, and the
Yeah.
kinds of fears that hold us back from living fully?
Yeah. The first thing I always want to say about fear is that if you're experiencing a lot of fear right now for whatever reason or about whatever thing, my heart goes out to you, and like I said earlier, your wound deserves attention and compassion. And if you're in imminent danger, like, you deserve someone to help you and protect you. And so fear is not the same thing as risk or actual danger. And now, often when we're in actual danger, adrenaline takes over and we're capable of quite heroic things. But it is a completely naturally occurring reality that our bodies and our minds respond with fight, flight, or freeze to stimuli that may be an actual saber-toothed tiger waiting around the corner, but more often than not is just a flash of orange color, or we are overreading the fear. And there's two things that I think can happen within us to change our experience of fear. One is to enlarge the sense of what I is, what me is. Enlarge it in a healthy way. I don't mean to become massive egotists and boors, but I tend to think that most people's ego problem is that our ego is too small. We don't understand our incalculable worth, and we don't mirror that to others.
Mm.
And if you enlarge the sense of I, it does not mean that the risk isn't real. It doesn't mean the danger isn't real. It doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. But it can mean that you have a bit of distance from the way that danger and risk affects you, even if it is coming right for you, even if you're being deeply targeted by it. Now, absolutely, like when it comes to sociological reality and the tangible circumstances of people's lives, people with more power should be using it to help people with less power. End of story. End of story. Everybody should be doing that. Everybody. And people with less power deserve to find communities in which they can be supported in the places where they have less power without being condescended to, because everybody with less power also has some power somewhere, some gift that they
Mhm.
can share. That's the first piece. And the second is the practices associated with this enlarging of the eye are really simple and they're time honored. They've been around for thousands of years, and there's contemporary neuroscientific variations on these. And as I've already said, some of the people who've suffered the most have been the pioneers in this. And they're so simple. One is to breathe more slowly, which is to do with connecting with silence, and move more slowly, just slow things down. And the other is to look for, find, cultivate a community small enough to be meaningful, of people also on a conscious journey of growth, evolution, awakening, becoming more human, becoming kinder people that you can share your needs and your gifts with. And there's many ways to do that. Some people do it through organized religion. Some people fall into it with their next door neighbors. Most of us have to opt into it because our culture doesn't push us together in ways that it would have done if we all lived in villages. But I don't want to reify the idea that all villages were always full of happy, interdependent people. Some of them were, and there are some happy, interdependent people whose primary relationships are with people they've only ever met on Zoom. It doesn't have to be a certain way, but I don't think that there's any substitute for breathing more slowly and being in small, interdependent communities as a way of enlarging the I, so that the I that is experiencing the fear is more able to cope with it. The book is called How Not to Be Afraid. It's not called How to Stop Feeling Fear.
Mm.
It's more like when people say what not to wear, they don't mean walk around naked. The book could just as easily have been called How to Be Afraid Well. And I'm on a lifelong journey to experience the transformation of my fear. And it has involved therapy, and it has involved spiritual direction. It's involved mentoring, and it's involved medication, and it's involved a lot of fear. And I don't think you get cured of this, but you can experience some repair. There is healing possible. And one of the things that we're living in this time where everything's happening at once.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's happening is that there's more of an acceptability for people to discuss their wounds and their trauma and PTSD and things like that. There's also at the same time more of an assertion that that's weakness and I'm a strong guy and I'm not going to talk about that weak, quote unquote, weak stuff. And
Mhm.
there's a third thing, which is there's not enough conversation about things like trauma that involves the hope of healing. Again, not that you click your fingers and cure it,
Yep.
but there really is healing and repair possible, or integration, or a way of having your PTSD as being a part of you that's not as big a part as it used to be. That's really possible. That's really possible. And even if you're in the depths of it right now, I want to say to you, this does not have to be the way it is forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like how we hear that phrase that the book is based on, the body keeps the score. And
Yes,
we immediately go to all the ways that our body spare the wounds and the traumas and the thing we've experienced. But like the body also keeps the score of joy and pleasure
absolutely.
and happiness.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Yeah. It doesn't just keep the score of when you lost the Super Bowl. It keeps the score of when you won the Super Bowl. It
yeah.
absolutely, it keeps the score of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, if I fall and cut my knee, which I once did when I was 10 years old, I had a spectacular fall and I've never seen as much blood come out of me. Like if I fall and cut my knee, the naturally occurring thing is I'm going to think more about the knee pain than about the fact that my hand is not cut.
Right.
That's only natural. But you actually can learn to, in the psychological literature, it's called pendulation. You
Mm.
can learn to pendulate between the knee pain and the hand that's not feeling pain, or between the painful memory and the happy memory.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it reminds me of the religious argument that some Christians get into, like the passage in the Hebrew Bible that says God's ways are not our ways, and how growing up sometimes I heard that passage being argued in terms of, and that's why God torments people forever in hell. And
Mm.
reading the passage in context, and I forget the exact context off the top of my head, but God's ways aren't our ways, is actually God explaining God's kindness and forbearance and forgiveness that is much more elevated than what maybe we in our more petty
Mm.
selves might think of. And so it's interesting how we can hear certain phrases, whether it's the body keeps the score or God's ways aren't our ways, and we
Hmm.
think of something terrible rather than something delightful. And
Yeah.
that's what
Yeah. I don't know why God would treat somebody worse than I would.
yeah, yeah, that would not be a God
I'm
worthy
not.
of the
I mean,
name.
there's people I've been angry at, and there've been people I've felt bitterness toward, and even a desire for retribution toward, and I have to work on that and allow that to be healed. But I don't think I'd ever send anyone to hell permanently.
Not permanently.
Not per. I don't even. Yes, I hope I wouldn't even send them there for a minute.
It's like a nice exfoliating spa for a week.
Ask me about this imagination summit, this mysterious imagination summit.
The yeah, absolutely. Let's go to it because you have created this really wonderful gathering called the Porch Gathering. And just want to say, by way of background, you are a serial gathering creator who has put together some wonderful things in the past. You and I, along with Jacob Kuntz and Laurel Meath and countless other volunteers, we founded the Wild Goose Festival back in the day.
Mhm.
You have gone on with our friend Mike Clausen to foment this news story gathering, and you have done movies and meaning. And a lot of, I think, what you've learned over the years is culminating in this gathering called the Porch Gathering, which is coming to our dear beleaguered mountains in just over a
Mhm.
month, March 13th through 16th. And having participated in several of these over the years, I would say that the Porch Gathering embodies what you are getting at in your books, using stories to transform both individuals and communities. You say the world isn't falling apart, but the story we're telling about it can use some help. So, what motivated you to create this unique festival meets retreat format of imagination and story? And what kind of transformation have you witnessed happening in these spaces?
First of all, thank you for that. And it's more true to say that I'm a co-creator of the Porch Gathering with other people, most especially my partner in life, and a lot of work we do together, Brian Ammons and many other people
Sure.
who are compelled by the idea that the stories we tell shape our lives, and that we need concentrated experiences that remind us of this, that can hopefully help us for the rest of the year. There's a reason why I love the fact that in pre-industrial society, people had festivals about once every 3 months. There'd be a harvest festival, there'd be a summer solstice festival, there'd be a winter solstice festival, and so on. And what's lovely about that was that if you lived in a village with about 50 people, I think I could probably cope for about 3 months with only having access to 50 people. But after 12 weeks or so, I'd be like hankering to see some other people. And so if 12 other villages, if they got together every 3 months, and there were now 600 people, um, that's too many people to spend every day with. But I'm up for that every 3 months. And I'm up for that if we know how to barley and the other village knows how to corn, um, that we can share the barley and the corn with each other. And if there's someone who knows how to play a lute, whatever a lute is, somebody who plays a didgeridoo. I don't know that I want a didgeridoo in my village if I've also already got a lute, but every season to have a festival that brings together the gifts of the people and there can be exchange and sharing. And that's why I believe in festivals. That like festivals have always been part of a healthy experience of life, and they should be a place where people bring their gifts and their needs, where we have offers and needs. And festivals have become commercialized in our culture, and I found after a while I don't like going to the really big ones because you never really get to experience the work of the artist on the stage. When there's 50,000 people there, or even 10,000 or even 5,000 people. So I like festivals that are a couple of hundred folks and that have some space between things, that have a bit of quiet and that are able to be experimental. And the Porch Gathering is our experiment in an imaginative story community. Now, when we say it's about transformative storytelling, what we mean is transformation of both the audience that's listening or paying attention to the story, uh, but also transformation of the person telling and crafting the story. That there's an ethical responsibility and a spiritual gift in the act of preparing a story to be told. You can let this kind of bigger thing work on you. But then also the transformation of the story itself, which is, I think, one of the things that's happening in Wonder Woman, that Patty Jenkins and her co-writers are they are changing the nature of of the story of how to deal with a villain and the story of what a hero is. And the transformation for us is in the direction away from stories of separation, of scapegoating, of selfishness, and towards stories of increasing union with others and with the rest of the ecosystem, of shared responsibility, and of connection with the both what I call the common good and the cosmic good. And it may sound like a cheesy phrase for people. I'm just trying to reach for something that expresses the fact that our lives are lived both in the mundane, everyday realities, but also the ineffable. Again, whether you call it God or the cosmos, whether you're a pure secularist and just believe we're made of stardust, or you're a deeply religious person and you believe you're made in the image of God, either of those ideas are extraordinary, require extraordinary imagination to even touch 1% of them. And I happen to be someone who believes that we are both made of stardust and in the image of God. And like you could spend 1,000 lifetimes pondering that and being overcome by that. And our porch gathering is just a little taste of the fun of that. And it also wrestles with some of the issues that are confronting us in our society. It's not what people might understand as a traditional storytelling festival, in that while we do have people standing on a stage telling stories, that's not what most of it is. And you don't have to be a professional storyteller to come to the event. Our view is that every human being is already a storyteller, just most of us are unconscious of that.
Yeah.
And it would be worth it to ask ourselves, what are the stories we're believing and telling? Are they the most true stories? And are they the most helpful stories? And I'm talking about the story we tell by the way we are at the checkout in the grocery store, whether we're a customer or the person running the checkout, or the story we tell when we're getting cut off in traffic, or we feel the urge to cut someone else off in traffic, or the story we tell when we despair. There might be reasons for that. Or the story we tell when we feel like we've achieved a victory, what's the cost to somebody else for my victory? Maybe there are some victories that are pure win-wins,
Hmm.
but there's a lot of victories that cost somebody else something. So that's what it is. And one of the stories we're trying to tell with it is to make it accessible to people, regardless of the budget they have available, because money is a story, and the story that our society tells about money is that if people have a lot of it, they deserve that, and if people don't have a lot of it, they deserve that, and that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Money is not distributed by a fairness wizard. Money is distributed by a fundamentally unjust and often arbitrary system. And so we make the event accessible to people. If you can pay more, we ask you to pay more. If you can pay less, we're delighted for you to pay less.
Yes, the Robin Hood method. Yeah, I love that. And let's not sell you short, Gareth. If you were to come to the Porch Gathering, you would hear some top-notch storytelling by Gareth and other speakers. You've really been upping your narrative immersive experience in recent years. And so I find that I feel inspired by those kind of peak moments of storytelling. Like last year, you had priest and theologian James Allison coming and retelling the story of Jesus in some profound and unexpectedly funny ways. But at the same time, to your point, there are workshops oriented towards us, every individual, discerning our own stories and who are we and what kind of stories do we want to tell about ourselves. And I think that's something that my beloved ex-wife, Jasmine Pittman, does really well with her knowledge of story and craft and leading others through. And this year, I'll be sharing about a process that I've come to call contemplative composting, where we look at the ruin and decay of what previously served in our lives, whether that is our religious beliefs or perhaps a job or a career, or even our cherished beliefs about our nation and what it can become. And I find that oftentimes we're caught in these false binaries where we think that either we need to continue eating the same diet all the time, even if it's not actually healthy for us, or that we need to throw that food away and incinerate it. And that composting provides us a lovely way to let the refuse, to let the rot actually nourish the soil of what comes next. And that with some very intentional contemplative and appreciative inquiry practices, we can actually choose. We can actually have choice around what it is that we want to bring forward from the things that are no longer serving. I think it's just brilliant what you're putting together. And how would someone find out if they can connect with and come to the Porch Gathering this year?
If they close their eyes and exercise the imagination deeply and really scrunch up your eyes really tight and ask yourself, what could possibly be the name of the website for an event called the Porch Gathering?
Yeah.
What could it possibly be?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think if you spell it backwards and you take out the vowels,
and then I would invite you to go to theporchgathering.com,
okay.
theporchgathering.com,
The letdown.
and that'll give you all the information, and be lovely to have you, especially if you haven't been there before. If you've come before, you know why you want to come back, and we're delighted that there's a growing community that comes. I think it'll be a bit of an oasis, and it goes from the 13th to the 16th of March.
Does that begin on a Thursday or?
It begins on a Thursday night. There's an optional workshop in the afternoon of Thursday the 13th by this amazing teacher called Gloria Burgess, which is she's calling the little workshop. It's a 3 hour long workshop. She's calling it Sanctuary, and it's about respite for what she calls the servant soul. A lot of us are putting a lot out at the moment. We've given a lot, and this is about finding a bit of an oasis in the middle of that. But the main event begins Thursday night, the 13th, and it ends about 10 o'clock at night on Saturday, the 15th. And people tend to depart on the Sunday morning. I know that a lot of people who have professional responsibilities on a Sunday to come as well. And I would encourage them, if you've got to be back home by Sunday morning, come to the event, go to the Thursday afternoon workshop, and stay through as much of Saturday as you can. And we are live streaming some of the program and recording a lot of it for available later. So there's an online option as well. And yeah, so love people to come. And now's the
Beautiful.
time to register. At the website, I can't quite remember the website again. It was very complicated. Do you remember what
Yeah.
it was, Mike?
Yeah, it was this really complicated sigil once you took all the vowels out, but maybe it's the
Yeah.
porchgathering.com. Yeah.
I think it might be the porchgathering.com. Yes. Try that and see.
See if it works. If not, get back to us, send out some, carrier pigeon, and we'll figure it out. But yeah, it'd be a lot of fun to have you. It's at Montreat in the mountains of Western North Carolina, which are slowly but surely recovering from the devastation of Helene. And we'd love to extend some mountain hospitality to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks,
Absolutely.
Gareth, for this far ranging conversation. And I know I'll see you soon and hopefully can see some of the rest of you.